Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The room's almost full. We've got 46 people online. We've got a full house. Welcome. Good evening. In these dark and gloomy days, we all need some bright points of light to cheer our time and to remind us of why we're here, what we aspire to as archaeologists, and more generally, as people. In the life of the McDonald Institute, one of the brightest of those lights each year is provided by our statutory annual lecture. Over 34 years, this event has brought a sequence of brilliant academic thinkers and doers and speakers to our community in Cambridge. People who, in the words of the commentary to the launch of Artemis 1 a few hours ago, take us to the moon and beyond. It's therefore my very great pleasure to welcome this evening our latest star speaker, Amy Bogaard, Professor of Neolithic and Bronze Age Archaeology and Head of the School of Archaeology at Oxford University. Amy is a scholar of immense breadth and depth, and in the best of senses, impossible to capture in a few words. An archaeological scientist in pursuit of big social questions and comparisons across time and space. Equally, a social and landscape archaeologist with a rigorous knowledge of science, primarily archaeobotany, but working outwards from there towards both the biomolecular and the ethnographic. She advances practice, method, and theory in equal measure, and she combines detailed grasp of detail with blue skies questions. Her enduring focus, if you can call a continent a focus, has been on the practices and consequences of early farming, from domestication to urbanism, in particular what she terms the farming inequality nexus. She has pursued this over much of Europe, the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia, with forays into South and East Asia. Amy's tellingly hybrid foundations lie jointly in a first degree in classical and Near Eastern archaeology at Bryn Mawr and an MSc and PhD in environmental archaeology at Sheffield, where she trained with Glynis Jones. She exemplifies that department's extraordinary track record of new generation talent over many decades. From Sheffield, she took up a lectureship at Nottingham, then Oxford, rising in a few short years to her current chair. In that time, she has published prolifically, broadly, and to great effect, including many highly influential articles and several books, not least her first, of 2004, Neolithic Farming in Central Europe. She has led, or co-led, 2 major ERC-funded projects, her own AgriCurb, or AgriCurb, I suppose actually is the best word, AgriCurb, on the agricultural origins of urban civilization, and the Synergy Grant Explo, in collaboration with Thessaloniki and Bern. Their impressive scholarly values aside, both projects underscore Amy's success and dedication to building dynamic, interdisciplinary teams and her effective championship of next-generation scholars. Unsurprisingly, her pathway has been strewn with honours, an external professorship at the Santa Fe Institute, a Shanghai Archaeological Forum Research Award, and most recently her fellowship of the British Academy. This evening, Amy will bring to bear her formidable understanding of the patterns and diversity of past farming practices and societies to explore what the future might or could hold for us as food producers of tomorrow. Amy, welcome to Cambridge. We warmly look forward to your lecture, the 34th McDonald Annual Lecture on Prehistoric Farming Futures. The podium is yours. Over to you.
Well, no pressure then. Thank you for that incredibly generous introduction, Cyprian. I'm delighted to be here. I'm honored to speak to an audience of such deep and varied expertise. Thank you all for coming. My aim in this lecture is to think through how we translate the wealth of archaeological data we have on the deep past of farming into a new kind of interdisciplinary and planetary discussion about more sustainable futures. As I hope to show, and drawing on recent work in Western Asia and Europe, the nature of early farming continues to reveal surprises and to resist influential narratives which, I argue, get in the way of creative thinking about future farming. The emerging evidence challenges several notions that are particularly entrenched with respect to early farming in Western Eurasia. One is that farming was always primarily about human control over other species, even to the extent that crops were grown in perfectly rectangular fields, according to these otherwise admirable reconstructions. Another is that the classic domesticates, the founder crops as they're often termed, were the exclusive foundation for subsequent developments. And a third is that farming evolved through a stately sequence of revolutions, and therefore that future food security depends on ever more controlled and incremental gains in productivity from a mere handful of species. We now have grounds for arguing, on the contrary, that the initial technological revolutions of agriculture are more misleading than helpful in many ways, in light of high-resolution evidence now available. That there was much creative experimentation in cropping systems and plant use, both within Western Asia and as farming spread and matured in Europe. And that the emergence of farming in Western Asia was primarily about human dependence upon the agencies and ecologies of other species. So I'd like to develop these and some related arguments in the following sequence. I will start by considering formative early agrobiodiversity in Western Asia. I'll then move on to Southeastern Europe and to comparing what I'm terming here the dry and wet Neolithics. We will then move on to Central and Western Europe to consider innovation and diversification by Neolithic farmers in that region. I then want to shift to the Bronze Age, briefly, to consider agricultures of power and resistance. And I'll finish with some thoughts on the radical potential, as I see it, of prehistoric farming for the future. So let's start then with early agrobiodiversity in Western Asia. And I'll start with the climatic context in which farming emerged. As many of you will know, the Greenland ice core records, featuring cores like GISP2, give us a vital record of past climate in the Northern Hemisphere, based on annual ice layers capturing stable oxygen isotope ratios that provide a basis for reconstructing air temperature. The broad story is that Holocene climate sustains the emergence of agriculture, not only because it's warmer, but also because it's more stable than in the Pleistocene, so the amplitude of temperature is smaller. The Agassiz core, which is further north in Greenland, gives us reconstructed temperature anomalies over the last 12,000 years, so the Holocene, and you can see that in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. Temperature is shown in the dark red color. This also captures recent abrupt warming, heading back towards early Holocene levels. So part of the whole concern around accelerated anthropogenically induced climate change is not only temperature increase, but disruption of the relative stability that we've enjoyed through the Holocene so far. So how did human communities in Western Asia react to greater climate stability in the early Holocene? The answer, developed over the last 20 years, has been that communities in various regions of Western Asia responded by cultivating wild cereals from the mid-10th millennium BC, so this is the Levantine pre-pottery Neolithic A, to support more sedentary ways of life made possible through climate change. This new human intervention in the landscape gave rise to the monumentalism of the pre-pottery Neolithic A, as illustrated, for example, by the tower at Jericho, the enclosures of Göbekli Tepe, and the communal buildings of Jerf al-Ahmar. The inference of pre-domestication cultivation, however, turns out to be based on flawed ecological reasoning. The key evidence that is used to infer pre-domestication cultivation has been the occurrence of potential arable weed taxa alongside the ostensible cultivars. Botanical surveys of wild and cultivated cereal stands in the Levant, led by Alex Weide, have shown, however, that both habitats, both wild and cultivated cereals, harbor potential weed taxa, meaning that the mere occurrence of these taxa archaeobotanically does not distinguish natural and cultivated cereals. Fortunately, a new model based on the functional ecology of potential weeds does distinguish annually tilled cultivated fields from unmanaged wild cereal stands. And the upshot, so far, is that archaeobotanical assemblages previously interpreted as indicating pre-domestication cultivation in the PPNA actually resemble natural wild cereal habitats. In the red box on the far right-hand side of this slide, I've highlighted a summary of the current state of knowledge with natural wild cereal conditions indicated with light orange shading and annually tilled cereals in green shading. And there's currently a gap between the two. That's where I've put the big question mark. And Dr. Alex Weide is focusing on that ambiguity, that period, in a current Leverhulme Fellowship. So more work is needed to refine this picture, but the emerging evidence suggests that the new monumentality of the PPNA arose from human dependence on natural savanna grasslands that were likely subject to communal protection and conservation. In other words, this new materiality is actually about a distinctive ecosystem featuring large seeded grasses that naturally formed extensive self-sowing stands. In fact, they look remarkably like fields. That's what you see in the lower right-hand corner. And this was under the warmer, more stable conditions of the early Holocene. Strictly speaking then, current evidence suggests that the start of the pre-pottery Neolithic isn't the start of the Neolithic in the sense of cultivation, but rather it's the culmination of Pleistocene developments. A further implication of this work has to do with the diversity of natural wild cereal habitats. Early forms of plant management in Western Asia, stretching back at least to the Upper Paleolithic, turn out not to be about selecting individual species, the progenitors of later crops, but rather about managing entire diverse stands of vegetation, both what we would call in hindsight crops and weeds. So plant diversity was embedded in the earliest forms of management from the outset. The emerging diversity of plant use beyond annual wild cereals is also revealed through recent work in the central Zagros, and I'm drawing here upon the CZAP project led by Wendy and Roger Matthews at Reading. In this study, Jade Whitlam has found a mix of smaller seeded perennial and annual grasses being processed for consumption, none ever domesticated, and this shines a light on higher altitude adaptations accompanying, in this region, goat hunting. So a delay in the start of cultivation into the subsequent pre-pottery Neolithic B has the knock-on effect of aligning, for the first time, the onset of plant cultivation and of animal herding. After decades of debate about which came first, it now turns out that both herding and cultivation co-evolved with the modular household, defined by having internal storage and cooking facilities. In this perspective, the atomization of communities into households reflected the new importance of human labor investment in creating and maintaining conditions for growth in managed plants and animals beyond their natural habitats. And nowhere is this more clear than in this co-evolutionary process, that is, between cultivation, herding, and housing, than in central Anatolia, notably outside the Fertile Crescent as traditionally defined, and framed by what Mary Steiner, Mihraban Uzbasharan, and Güneş Duru have called a greater Fertile Crescent, and that's what's highlighted in red here. The key sequence of Catalhoyuk has documented a shift through time from broad-spectrum hunting to caprine herding, alongside a continued diverse plant spectrum. And that spectrum included, and here we're just looking at the cereal component of it, domestic forms of naked wheat and barley that could only persist under cultivation, as well as an early occurrence of a kind of wheat termed in the archaeobotanical literature the new type of bloom wheat, or NGW, a lost crop of prehistoric Western Eurasia that I'll come back to shortly. So the fused beginnings of cultivation and herding and their collective biodiversity usher in a new kind of in situ persistence, now on a scale not of centuries but of millennia. And we can trace this new sustainability in detail through the 1500-year sequence at Catalhoyuk, beginning in the late 8th millennium BC. The story here begins with the settlement's founding alongside a broad belt of braided river channels. This ecotonal setting, although distinctly suboptimal from a modern agronomic perspective, which is all about homogeneity, afforded a mosaic of habitats and growing conditions for diverse plant management. It was also a landscape dotted with sheep, and sheep herding was integrated with diverse cropping throughout the sequence. So the archaeobotanical evidence at Catalhoyuk, which is one of now the best documented assemblages in the world, and certainly in Western Asia, has given us evidence for over 20 plant species that were routinely used as food. And these are not mere occurrences in archaeobotanical samples. We actually have evidence that they were processed and stored. And I'm only showing you a selection here. And among these plants are species that were locally recruited from the accompanying weed flora. One of these is a tiny seeded wild mustard, which filled a gap in the crop spectrum as a source of oil. And that was a distinctive aspect of Catalhoyuk and its plant-related practice, in that flax doesn't make it here as a crop, so there wasn't access to linseed. In Britain, this species of tiny-seeded wild mustard is known as flaxweed, and this may be familiar to some of you because it grows in East Anglia. In fact, just a little bit to the east of us in the Breckland region. So we encountered multiple storage deposits of this wild mustard plant, including this clay bin that you see on the left-hand side that was packed with more than 30 liters of the cleaned seeds. The broad plant spectrum at Catalhoyuk also incorporates the same so-called new type of bloom wheat that we saw earlier at Catalhoyuk, and is attested also more locally at Bonjukluhuyuk from the later 9th millennium BC. This wheat type becomes a major crop, the dominant bloom wheat, in the middle of the Neolithic sequence, so around 6,500 BC, where we begin to find it in pure storage concentrations in the north area or north neighborhood of the site. And I will digress here briefly to explain that this kind of wheat remained undetected in the archaeobotanical record until Glynis Jones, Tanya Valamotti, and Mike Charles defined the morphotype in 2000 in prehistoric Greek material. They noted its distinctive resemblance to Triticum timofeevi, or Timofeeves wheat. This is a kind of wheat which was known from early 20th century botanical collections from several villages in western Georgia, but was otherwise extinct. So the identity of the new bloom wheat as part of the distinctive G genome Triticum timofeevi group has recently been confirmed through ancient DNA. And incidentally, this is a clear example of paleogenomics working to address a strategic question framed through archaeological analysis, in this case decades of archaeobotanical observation of morphological variation and of the distribution of morphotypes. In other words, ancient DNA would be no shortcut on its own. So in the wheat family tree, which is shown here, Timopheves wheat arose from Triticum aroraticum, which is a sister species of wild emmer, Triticum dicocoides, in a separate domestication sequence. And part of that domestication sequence can now be traced in situ through the 7th millennium BC at Catalhoyuk, where the crop changes from a semi-shattering form to a non-shattering form. Geometric morphometric analysis of grain shape shows a simultaneous shift from wild aroraticum to domesticated Timophevi morphology in the grain. These gradual changes take place alongside cultivation of domesticated emmer and domesticated naked forms of wheat and barley. In other words, it appears likely that the Timophevi wheat group at Catalhoyuk was under cultivation along with these other domesticated cereals, and that the shift to non-shattering was effected under a combination of cultivation and storage of the new crop, with seed corn for the following year coming from individual houses. This sequence at Catalhoyuk therefore adds weight to the argument that genetic isolation due to household storage was important for the loss of the wild shattering habit in cereals, and this is a case recently advanced by Alexander Weide for earlier domestication of other bloom weeds. The adoption of edible weedy species and the domestication of Timopheves wheat are examples of the remarkable creativity that fostered resilience over 1,500 years at Catalhoyuk and through a series of environmental and social changes. We've used the concept of the panarchy from resilience theory in ecology and argued that the panarchy of households, each experimenting in different ways with potential plant foods and staples, was fundamental to collective resilience. And it was the integration of biodiverse cultivation and herding, as fomented in communities like Ashikli and like Catalhoyuk, that unleashed the spread of farming and farming households to Europe. More detail is needed on the human genomics of late Pleistocene and early Holocene populations in Western Asia. This recent study by Marchi et al. Draws attention to the coincidence between integrated biodiverse cultivation and herding on the one hand, and population movement within Anatolia and then further westwards on the other. So my next stop will be the Neolithic of Southeast Europe, specifically from the perspective of Lakeshore sites and the remarkable window they give us onto the ecology of early farming communities and their persistent strategies through time. So to set the stage, most of what we know about the Southeast European Neolithic is from dryland sites, tells, and flat extended settlements. Tells have been particularly informative about the house, its contents and activities, including destruction events that preserve in situ plant storage. Meanwhile, flat extended sites, such as Makrialos in northeastern Greece, preserve more fluid domestic arrangements alongside spectacular evidence for communal, even regional, feasting events. These sites afford highly structured snapshots of Neolithic life, but the everyday detritus of living is heavily filtered taphonomically, in particular by the constraints of charred plant preservation. We know from decades of research on lakeshore sites in the circumalpine foothills of Central Europe that rapid deposition of everyday rubbish into high groundwater anaerobic conditions preserves waterlogged evidence for seasonal use of gathered plants alongside episodic charring of cereal and pulse crops stored for year-round consumption. So against this background, a current ERC synergy project, Explo, opens up an opportunity to shed new light on the Southeast European Neolithic by focusing on its understudied lakeshore sites. This is a collaboration featuring dendrochronology and paleoecology at the University of Bern, ceramics and material culture at Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and bioarchaeology at Oxford. The bioarchaeological work features archaeobotanical work by these four fantastic colleagues on the project. There is also great faunal work ongoing, but my focus here will be on the plant side of things. Fieldwork since 2019 has focused on 3 lakeshore sites, ranging from fully or partially submerged to terrestrial sites located on the present-day Lakeshore. These 3 sites provide an environmental transect from Mediterranean to transitional subalpine zones. Dendrochronological and radiocarbon dating thus far indicates that the sites also provide a chronological transect from the mid-6th millennium to the mid to later 5th millennium BC, so over 1,000 years of lakeshore occupation from the mature Neolithic. The earliest of these sites, and indeed one of the earliest Neolithic lakeshore sites in Europe, is Dispilio on Lake Kastoria in western Greek Macedonia, beginning in the mid-6th millennium BC. And this is an excavation project led by Professor Kostas Kotsakis. You can think of Dispilio as like a waterlogged tell, with rapid deposition in what appears to have been a wetland lakeshore environment, preserving uncharred as well as charred plant evidence in the lower waterlogged part of the sequence. And I've showed you this section of one of the trenches where you can see this chocolatey sort of waterlogged layer in the bottom half. So at Dispilio, we see the classic contrast between charred crop evidence, including possible storage material, through uncharred crop remains, and then to uncharred seasonal fruits and nuts. We also have a lot of evidence for Timofeeves wheat in this assemblage. And I should just mention briefly that a consortium of about 20 of us is currently putting together all finds of Timofeeves wheat to date. And this is a map provided by Dragana Filipovic in Kiel, very grateful to her for that. And it's absolutely clear that Timofeeves wheat is part of the spread of farming to Europe, along with other much better known crops. And the last known finds in Europe date to the Iron Age. So, returning to the explo sites, we see a similar diverse plant spectrum at all of them, reflecting what Rachel Ballantyne calls the hedgerow Neolithic, the constant background of fruits and nuts from shrubby woodland edge habitats that were a renewable source of seasonal plant food. This is an aspect of the Southeast European Neolithic that we can only intercept occasionally on dryland sites, but the forage species we're talking about are not at all specific to lakeshore environments. They're ubiquitous woodland margin species that likely had a much wider relevance. And so it seems plausible then that the wet and dry Neolithic of Southeast Europe are in fact 2 sides of the same coin, as argued elsewhere for the circumalpine case. At the same time, the upland ecotonal settings of these lakeshore sites afford unusual insights into the adaptation of early farming to landscapes that were settled only in the middle to later Neolithic. From explo results thus far, and we're about midway into the project now, the overwhelming impression is that our millennium-plus long transect of sites charts persistent diversity of plant use through discrete settlement episodes. And so one line of argument that we're thinking hard about is that whereas the dry Neolithic, that is the classic tells, draw particular attention to physical persistence at certain favored locales in the landscape, the wet Neolithic preserves a more dynamic pattern of shorter occupations around lakes that collectively chart long-term resilience through persistently diverse, broad-spectrum plant practices. Right, in the next segment of my talk, I'd like to draw attention to the inventive efforts of early farming communities in Central and Western Europe to maintain biodiverse farming systems against the odds. These are efforts visible despite the restrictions of largely charred dryland plant preservation. These communities faced erosion of agrobiodiversity through chance founder effects, recently demonstrated in the spread of crops across southern Europe in work led by Anne de Varey, and for Central Europe, also with latitude, as recently synthesized by Angela Kreutz and colleagues. And the upshot for the LBK, the linear band ceramique, so the early Neolithic of lowland Central Europe, was a relatively narrow crop base, albeit somewhat broader, now that we have begun to detect Timofeev's wheat alongside einkorn and emmer. At Feingen, on the Enns River in the Neckar Valley, there is a consistent deposition of gloom or hulled wheats, einkorn, emmer, and Timofeev's wheat as a mixed crop and in rather consistent proportions, and I hope you can see that in the plan in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. This mixed cropping system, with a degree of diversity embedded in the staple cereal, can be understood as a strategy attuned to the high risks faced by rapidly dispersed communities that formed long-distance networks. And you can see examples of those networks in the Neckar region in the map in the lower right-hand corner. Another creative practice of LBK farmers, including at Feingen, was to diversify the crop spectrum by gathering native ruderal plants that had turned into invasive weeds, like goosefoot. So we find concentrations of these seeds in high-density deposits. And a third strategy was to adopt new crops through cultural contacts, including opium poppy from the cardial sphere of the central and western Mediterranean. And as an aside, again from LBK Feingen, when opium poppy appears at this particular settlement, it has a restricted spatial distribution. And I would argue that this is again a panarchy of households with part of the community experimenting with this new crop. Notwithstanding these measures to diversify, a demographic boom-bust sequence has been inferred from synthesis of radiocarbon dates for parts of the LBK area. Bayesian modeling of radiocarbon dates from individual site sequences supports the inference of a hiatus, perhaps a couple of centuries, in settlement in some regions, such as the Upper Rhine. The interpretation and causal background of these phenomena is not straightforward, but I would draw attention to two observations. One is that cycles of demographic increase and decline are to be expected from resilience theory and the adaptive cycle. The question is their amplitude and recovery time. Second is the very obvious fact that farming persisted. There was a reconfiguration and reemergence of regional groups with LBK-related material culture, and they remained farmers with a similar agroecology, including that they picked up some specific crops, naked wheat and barley, that we see towards the very end of the LBK in some waterlogged well fills. So the Neolithization story has been one of creative strategies on the part of households and communities for maintaining and enhancing plant biodiversity, including dynamic combinations of exotic and native species. Beyond the boom-bust narrative for the Western European Neolithic, the big fact is that biodiverse farming persisted, including its integration with herding, through an active process of experimentation. The Neolithic Revolution was an iterative process of finding new creative solutions to farming under shifting climatic, ecological, and social circumstances. It was a triumph of persistent creativity. What happens as we move into the worlds of the Bronze Age? I will need to be very strategic and selective in looking at this, but there is some spectacular evidence that addresses this question if we return to central Anatolia. So we're shifting now to the north-central Anatolian plateau and to the Hittite capital of Hattusha, and a massive underground granary or silo complex that was destroyed by fire in the early 16th century BC. It had a capacity of 5,000 to 7,000 tons, enough to feed 20,000 to 30,000 people for a year. So the Hittites were serious. This demonstrates their ability to amass large-scale surplus. Tons of cereals were preserved by charring when the silo was destroyed by fire, and the chambers with intact crop deposits are those outlined here in color. The cereals are mostly gloom wheats, einkorn and emmer, little sign here of Timofeev's wheat, and also hulled barley. On one level, this incredible find demonstrates how crop diversity was diminished under conditions of expansive, low-input agriculture and land-based wealth inequality. The state intervened in promoting the growth of a few stress-tolerant cereal crops that could be taxed. But these political strategies were complicated and really outmaneuvered by the practices of small-scale producers who continued to grow a diversity of crops and to enhance the resilience of the overall system. Thus, in the Hattusha silo, we get traces of other cereal and pulse crops, such as this small-seeded kind of broad bean, other than the hulled wheats and barley that were actually being collected in. And this is currently being explored further by Charlotte Diffie as part of a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship. As has often been observed in the archaeology of early literate societies in Western Asia and the Aegean, the diversity of crops that we see archaeobotanically is far greater than what early bureaucratic authorities were monitoring. We see this, for example, also in the Linear B of final palatial Knossos, so now in the second half of the second millennium BC, where loans of oxen and the harvest and ration payments of one particular cereal type are recorded. These political systems simplify agriculture down to an expansive, conspicuous production of monocultures. Where this strategy appears resilient, I would argue, is because small-scale farmers continued to practice biodiverse subsistence farming, as we see in the background of the Hattusha silo. James C. Scott, in Against the Grain, has observed that states are built on particular cereals, like wheat or rice or barley, and not, for example, on pulses. But in a sense, I think he's missing the point. Or rather, and ironically, he's emphasizing the textual evidence of the stories early states tell about themselves over the actual archaeological evidence for the full spectrum of what is happening. Recent collaborative work on the lower Ypsades hill, just south of the palace at Knossos, has intercepted an interesting moment during the 13th century BC in the aftermath of the palace's destruction. And this Google Earth image actually comes from, I think this is mid-July 2015, and you can see some of the areas where excavation was ongoing and where we had shelters set up where I'm gesturing to now. A modest house of just over 100 meters square, and I'll add an outline here to make that more clear, burned down during the ceramic phase early late Minoan 3B, destroying a series of crop stores in the southern room of the structure, which was under excavation from when this orthophoto was taken. But you can see this sort of orange tinged space that's from the burning. I think you can also perhaps pick out the detail of pithos jars, storage jars, or holes to take such jars being aligned at the back of this large southern room and also cut into the bedrock floor of another small room. And notice how storage is concentrated at the back of the house, what would have been the coolest and darkest part of the house, whereas the house itself, you can see its ashlar facade here, faced into the Knossos Valley. The stored crops were exclusively pulses, consisting of 5 different species, including a type of lathyrus or vetchling, likely originating in the eastern Aegean, and I'm drawing here on recent doctoral work by Tom Malthus. The archaeobotanical remains, therefore, demonstrate the survival of a diverse local agroecology despite the monoculture promoting power structures of the Cnossian state. So the palace and its apparatus, including Linear B, collapsed, likely in part due to climate change, the 3.2 K BP dry episode, but biodiverse farming knowledge and practice persisted. So I would like to conclude with some thoughts about what I see as the radical potential of prehistoric farming and its lessons for future farming practice and food security. I've argued that Neolithic and Bronze Age farming in Western Eurasia presents a series of case studies in the importance of biodiverse plant food cultures, including a panarchy of small-scale creative experimentation. These cultures today are maintained above all by small-scale producers, and intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations FAO are looking carefully at in situ conservation of land races and how this can benefit and give stability to smallholder farming. So it's not just about ex situ conservation in seed banks, for example. These discussions are beginning to include archaeological input on the deep time importance of diverse cropping. And for example, last summer there was a meeting convened by Dorian Fuller with people from the FAO on just that topic. And there's much, much more to do in this interdisciplinary space, including with crop wild relatives and lost crops, highlighted by archaeological evidence. As archaeologists, I think part of the challenge is that we need to develop new ways of working and communicating, and new ways of training ourselves and our students to realize this interdisciplinary potential systematically. Interdisciplinary potential is demonstrated, for example, by the way in which the long-term archaeological record for Triticum timothyvi as a prehistoric crop has helped bring it to the attention of crop scientists working on the genetics, diversity, and also neglected crop progenitors and breeding for new characteristics. This new interest from crop science is emerging in the context of long-term declines in the yields of elite crop breeds that demand huge inputs of mineral fertilizer and water, which in turn, of course, exacerbates climate change. So this is a crucial entry point for archaeology. The planetary conversations we can contribute to include the upcoming COP15 meeting in Montreal in December, which will feature the final negotiations around the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the Global Biodiversity Framework for post-2020. This sets targets of protecting 30% of land and sea by 2030, the so-called 30 by 30 plan that you've probably heard of. And a particular focal point is protections for local and indigenous peoples to manage biodiversity, potentially bringing together the biodiversity, climate, and human rights agendas, or that's the dream. I'm one of 10 Oxford delegates that's due to attend COP15, and what's interesting is that most of the people who came forward, because it was voluntary to attend, were not faculty but students, most coming from interdisciplinary backgrounds and with training to understand the kind of inputs that archaeology offers. So clearly this upcoming generation is going to be crucial for taking this work forward. But it's not only about the upcoming generation, it's about listening to older generations of cultivators and allotmenteers as well. J.C. Nyala, who is a doctoral student in anthropology at Oxford, has drawn attention to the allotment boom during the pandemic and their historic role in the UK in times of crisis for a combination of food security and well-being. With the energy crisis, this popularity is, of course, set to continue. I will conclude with the thought or the aspiration that our own individual activism as backyard gardeners, however inept in my case, is an opportunity to relearn the art of growing things, new varieties and tastes, the needs and the whims of other species, and what got us into farming in the first place. And I want to thank all of you and dedicate this to Lisa. Thank you.
I've been asked to deliver a vote of thanks to Amy. This is an extremely easy task. It's a real privilege to be able to tell you how fundamental Amy's work has been to the field. And I'll keep it short and sweet because on the one hand, we all deserve a drink, and on the other hand, I suspect I'm preaching to the converted. Amy started out as a real paleobotanist, able to see the world in a grain of wheat. And one of the few to follow in Glynis Jones's tradition of seeing beyond what did they grow to really seeing agriculture as a set of cultural practices and as the construction of new ecosystems. I've always deeply admired this aspect of Amy's work. It asks imaginative questions about what people do in ways that would put most theoretical material culture analysts to shame. But tonight you've seen Amy in a different vein, and as you've seen, she's also a major theoretical force. She's written about big themes. I won't mention her recent work on inequality and coevolution, but I think that this kind of work is one of our best hopes for overcoming, for example, the long-term divide between people who think about history and people who think about evolution. I'll just make one more remark tonight. Over the years, I've become really cynical about the statement you encounter in articles, books, public talks, grant applications, about how archaeology is going to save the world and knowing the past will help us solve all the problems in the future. Easy to say, hard to do. But I think tonight's lecture may convince us of a different way. And I love the thought that the crop that we're all going to be eating when environments change in 20 years is going to be inspired by archaeology, developed possibly by someone here. And the next generation, as Amy says, is critical, and possibly in development somewhere on a small holding, not in a big agribusiness lab. So in that sense, one thing I take away from this, aside from a head full of new ideas, is some new hope for the future. So I hope you'll all join me first in thanking Amy, and second in going back to the McDonald for a drink to discuss this further. Thank you very much.